His diagnosis, his opinion, was that Hemy Neuman is malingering. He's faking mental illness. He's not bipolar. He's not mentally ill. He's just faking it. He didn't do his own testing. He did look over the testing and got the raw data that Dr. Flores did. And he said, it seems she administered the tests properly. She scored them properly. But still he disagreed with them. Yeah, they show that he wasn't malingering, but he's smart, so he can fake it. He can pass it. He seems to say that smart people can't be mentally ill, or at least these malingering tests would come up with some other test that they can't beat. He can't point to a reason why these tests weren't accurate. Just says, well, yeah, it doesn't matter. They're not right. Dr. Browning, he goes with Dr. Huey. He also reviews the information provided. And he does this evaluation with his boss. He tells you that, well, in a case that's this important, we send 2 doctors because we want to make sure we get it right. So if it's not a high media case, they don't care if they get it right? Is that what he wants you to believe? That doesn't make any sense. He did say that highly intelligent people, highly educated people, can still be mentally ill. He said that he spent about 200 hours reviewing the documents, going over the information that was provided to him. 200 hours in 25 days. That's 8 hours a day for every single one of those 25 days. Weekends, 4th of July, on top of his full-time job of overseeing the forensic unit, of checking the beds, seeing patients. And he said nobody's doing his job while he was also working on this case. That's not realistic. He said that trauma doesn't cause bipolar disorder, but if you have bipolar disorder and you experience a stressful or traumatic event, it can trigger symptoms. It can trigger an episode. And that's what we have here. That trigger was Neely's death. And the other events in the perfect storm. The trigger is the death of a woman he considered to be his mother, the one who saved him from what he considered to be abandonment. Now, Dr. Browning also discussed some differences, basically the same differences between the demon and the angel as Dr. Huey did, with the exception of the voice. I think he got that it was actually the same description of the voice. He discussed how many times Hemy Neuman said he had sex with Andrea. He said in 2016, he said at least a half a dozen times. But he admitted that he was still somewhat confused about that. Confused about where it happened, when it happened, whether it happened, still a little fuzzy on that. What Dr. Browning said about medication and the medication that Hemy Neuman is taking is significant. And here's why. Those medications, Remeron and Depakote, have serious side effects, serious adverse effects. And I went through several of those side effects and adverse effects with him. These are not medications like Tylenol or Advil. These are medications that, at least with respect to Depakote, can cause liver failure, pancreatitis, serious illnesses. So serious that Dr. Browning, when he prescribes these medications, does blood draws on his patients every 3 months to make sure their levels are okay. And yet they want you to believe that that man is faking it and just taking these medications and subjecting himself to these serious side effects and potential adverse effects just to fool you. He also told you about the medication and how it's prescribed. He said he looked at Hemy Neuman's medical records, the ones you'll have back there with you, and he reviewed them, and he reviewed the blood work. And Ms. Cross asked him about that medication. And again, Dr. Browning's opinion, his diagnosis, was that Hemy Neuman is malingering mental illness. Not that he's bipolar and it just doesn't meet the standard for insanity, but that he's malingering mental illness. He's faking it. He's not sick. Yet when asked about the medication that he's taking, he said that Hemy's medication dosage is reasonably appropriate. He said it's a reasonably appropriate for an effective dose for him. How is any medication reasonably appropriate? How is any dosage reasonably appropriate if he's not sick and doesn't need the meds? That seems to be an inconsistency. Dr. Browning said that if you're manic, you can't be successful. Dr. Flores disagreed and said, sure you can. And we'll talk about the various symptoms in a little bit. But Dr. Flores said, yeah, you can be successful and still have mania. And you know, you come in here with your collective experiences. And some of you have personal experiences. Some of you have professional experiences with folks with mental health problems, with illness. Some of you with bipolar disorder. You've read papers, you've read People magazine, you've read a number of different media, I'm sure. So you know that there are famous people across the ages, well-known people, writers, musicians, actors, actresses, who suffer from bipolar and are hugely successful. Dr. Browning and Dr. Huey work together to bolster one another. They do one interview lasting 3 hours and 20 minutes. Of all of the information they have, of all the time they said they spent on this case, only 3 hours and 20 minutes was spent with the subject of the matter. They didn't interview anyone. They didn't ask for his Georgia Tech transcript to verify his episode in 1981 of depression. They just wanted to be able to come in here and say he's lying, he's malingering. So they didn't do any extra work that might prove they're wrong. It's possible that they spent that much time, that together they spent 450 hours on this case, but it's unlikely, given that small time period, unless perhaps they're manic. That's a lot of time in a very short period of time. They didn't try to talk to his mother, his sister, his aunt, his uncle, the people that Dr. Flores spoke with, the family members who could corroborate his history, who did corroborate his history. They reviewed information provided without any independent investigation, without any independent interviews. That would be like you taking all of those things, going in the back and making a decision without ever having heard any testimony, maybe 3.5 hours of testimony. On a case that is important to so many people. They didn't ask Hemy how he felt about the failed attempt, and you heard about that failed attempt. In fact, Dr. Browning said he didn't remember even seeing it in the police reports, which means that Hemy had to bring that up to them. Although Dr. Flores told you it absolutely was in the police reports, and the story was exactly in the police reports as Hemy described it. Dr. Browning said they discussed hyperreligiosity with Hemy Neuman. Dr. Huey said they didn't. There's an inconsistency. Are they lying? They spent more time writing a 22-page report, and the state made a point of pointing out that their report was 22 pages and Dr. Flores was 5. They spent more time writing out that report to back up their opinion of malingering than they spent with Hemy Neuman. Dr. Huey said that Dr. Flores was wrong for reaching an opinion before doing any testing. She said she saw him 4 times in 2011, and she came to her opinion after the second time, and she did the testing after that. They formed their opinion without doing any testing at all. 6 years after the fact. Almost 6 years after the shooting, after therapy, after medication. Dr. Flores has been with this case since 2011. She said she spent over 200 hours on this case, and that's more realistic given the time frame. She spent 18 hours, more than 18 hours, with Hemy Neuman, the person she's making a diagnosis of. She did independent interviews with witnesses. She's talked to some folks from GE. She talked to family members. She didn't just take his word or decide he was just lying and leave it at that. She worked to corroborate or not. And she said it's important to do that. They all said it's important to know whether the person's telling the truth or not. She actually sought out that information. She spoke with Ms. Jerkovic, the therapist he saw. The state is either saying she's lying or the folks she spoke with are lying. She is every bit as educated and qualified as Dr. Brickhouse, Dr. Huey, Dr. Browning. It's part of her job as an assistant editor to stay on top of research. And so she does. And she told you about some of that research that she's done to explain why her opinions are different than Dr. Huey's and Dr. Browning's with respect to certain things. This is a doctor who has testified for the state and the defense. This is a doctor who worked at Georgia Regional for years. This is a doctor that the state tried to hire for this case. Remember, she said that. She said they called me about this case, but had already been hired by the defense. Perhaps if they'd beaten, the state had beaten the defense to it, we wouldn't even be here. You know she didn't take this case for the money. She told you that she got a flat fee, $5,000 in 2011, $20,000 this year. At $3.50 an hour, given the time she spent, she should have made about $75,000. It's a big pay cut. 50 grand, that's a lot of money. And that doesn't include what you can imagine she had to turn down in order to take this case and stay involved with this case. And Ms. Cross asked her, well, you must feel cheated. She said, no, I took it because it was the right thing to do. Now, do you really think that the state is going to go out and just hire this person, try to hire this person that they just think is a hired gun and will give an opinion based on who she's working for? No, not likely. So when they get up here and they say she's wrong, she doesn't know what she's talking about, keep that in mind. They tried to hire her. They respected her enough, they respected her abilities enough to try and hire her in this case. Her opinion, that he had undiagnosed and untreated bipolar disorder, manic with psychosis. And really, she's in the best position to render an opinion because she spoke with him closer in time to the event. She spoke with him back in 2011. And then she interviewed him again in 2016. She's got the benefit of having spoken to him when he was still symptomatic. He was still exhibiting symptoms when she spoke with him back in 2011. He wasn't and isn't in 2016. She examined him for mania and depression. The other two doctors didn't. Dr. Browning, though he said that history and present symptoms are important in his diagnosis, then turned around and said that, well, the depression's not really important, it's not relevant. When I asked him if he did an assessment for depression, if he dug any further into the issues about the demon, the differences in the size. No, it wasn't relevant. The demon was important enough as an inconsistency, but not important enough as a symptom to Dr. Browning and Dr. Huey. Dr. Flores admitted on several hypotheticals that were posed to her by Ms. Cross that if this or if that, yeah, her opinion might change. If this was the evidence, yes, that might change her opinion. If there was proof of X, yes, her opinion might change. Dr. Browning and Dr. Huey couldn't quite get there. When they were posed hypotheticals, well, yes, but, maybe, but still, they're so fixed in their opinions that nothing's going to change it. They, Dr. Browning and Dr. Huey, seem to think, well, I take that back. The state made a big deal about the term rescue delusion. Dr. Browning said that's not a term he uses. Dr. Flores testified to rescue delusion, and then she couldn't on command find where it was in the DSM. So what? That doesn't invalidate her opinion. It doesn't invalidate her diagnosis. Dr. Flores told you that in evaluating someone, she looks for things to determine if they're malingering. All the doctors told you that, especially in a criminal case when they're doing a forensic evaluation, that you have to consider malingering. And they all did. She told you that she looks for certain flags. And those flags are the presentation isn't right. The symptoms are wrong. The tests say malingering. That there's no corroboration. We don't have any of those things in this case. She did 3 different tests. She could have stopped at 1 or 2, but she wanted to be sure, so she did a 3rd. She corroborated the information he gave her. Dr. Huey and Dr. Browning didn't say that his presentation was wrong. They didn't say that his symptoms were wrong, except for the hallucinations, which usually present differently. They couldn't do a whole lot with the tests because they are what they are. He can beat them. That was their excuse. And pretty much everything he told them was corroborated with the exception of those small inconsistencies. And they didn't bother to find out anything otherwise. Dr. Flores talked about an overlap in symptoms, that you can have anxiety with bipolar. You can have narcissistic traits with bipolar. You can have trauma with bipolar. She talked about delusions and the definition of delusions. And the state got out through their experts that, a delusional disorder is that there is a delusional disorder and that that's different and separate from bipolar disorder. But Dr. Flores told you, and you'll have the index from the DSM that lists the pages where you can find information on delusions, that it's not in every section. There are multiple mental health disorders where hallucinations or delusions are possible. And it's not redefined in each of those sections. She never diagnosed him with a delusional disorder. She was simply defining delusions as they are defined in the DSM. Hemy Neuman. There is no evidence to the contrary that he grew up in a traumatic childhood household. Abusive father, alcoholic father, a mother who was largely absent, and when she was there, it was constant fighting between the parents. He's sent away to a foreign country at 13 years old by himself, doesn't know the language. He feels abandoned until he's rescued by Neely and her husband, Willie. In his childhood, he's witnessed his sister being sexually assaulted, and he feels a need to protect her in that instance as well as from his father. And then we come to 2010. His marriage is crumbling. His finances are a disaster. He's facing possible bankruptcy. Neely dies, and he meets and gets involved with Rusty Sneiderman. He talked about depressive episodes, and at no point did any of the doctors say that he said, I had a depressive episode. He described various times in his life where his mood was depressed. His sister told you about one specific time in 1981. They're home from school for the summer, and he didn't want to do anything. He just wanted to sit on the couch the whole weekend, or the whole summer. Didn't want to drive his new car. What teenage boy doesn't want to drive his brand new Mustang? She described him and his mood as low energy. With the exception of Dr. Brickhouse, no one said he wasn't depressed, just that it wasn't relevant to their diagnosis. Dr. Flores talked about his manic episodes. And I'll go through the 7 or 8 things that can be symptoms of mania. And Dr. Flores says that he suffered from several of them, that he had instances, time periods where he had these symptoms. Dr. Huey and Dr. Browning say the symptoms don't qualify or meet mania, in their opinion. Ultimately, it's for you to decide. And remember, you don't have to have all of these symptoms all of the time. You only need to have 3 for a week's period of time. Could be longer. It has to be at least a week. Grandiosity. Hemy Neuman told one of his coworkers that he was going to be on Forbes magazine. He wanted to be on Forbes magazine. Now, this is right after he just got a bad review at work. Jim Vano told you that he sat with the Sneiderman family at the Shiva. Well, that's weird. He's not a family member. He's elevated himself in his mind to a family member, but he's not. He's giving parenting advice to Andrea as though he's an expert. And you'll have that email back with you where he talks about his 10 tips for best parenting or whatever. Decreased need for sleep. This is something that's largely self-reported. The only other person who could have told them anything about this was his wife, and she didn't want to be interviewed by anybody. Talkative or pressured speech. Well, you heard from Orna Hannison. She said when he came to Houston and they met, he did 99% of the talking about personal life. That in and of itself was unusual, but he did 99% of the talking. And she said that was not normal of their conversations. Normally their conversations were much more interactive. Pressured speech. Something that was noted in his medical records that, again, you will have back with you. This is Defendant's Exhibit 36 that you will have back with you. It's also in the larger group of medical records. And in this particular note, the therapist, or the MD actually, notes that he had pressured speech. That's a doctor's note about that. That's not Hemy Neuman coming in and saying, oh, I have pressured speech. That's a doctor noticing that he's got pressured speech. And you'll have this back with you. Defendant's Exhibit 36. Flight of ideas or racing thoughts, that's not something that he really experienced much. Distractibility, who noticed that? Jerry Morton, the day before the shooting. He said normally Hemy Neuman ran great meetings. They were helpful, they were informative, they were well organized. This meeting was different. He was going over stuff that they had already implemented 6 months before. And when he called it to his attention, he said nothing. He just kind of looked over his head and carried on with the same thing. Again, he pointed out, dude, we've already done this. We're already doing this. And still, no response, just kind of looked over his head and continued on. This meeting was atypical of the meetings that Hemy normally ran. So all of the people that said, same old Hemy, there are little bits and pieces from these people that they obviously didn't recognize as signs and symptoms, but they are. And now that you have it all together, you know that. Another symptom, an increase in goal-oriented activity or agitation. And as a part of that, becoming more sociable, reconnecting with people, increased sociability. And we saw evidence of that. And I asked Dr. Browning about that specifically. I said, doesn't it cause some folks to be more socially outgoing? And I asked him, and he said yes. And I said, and you know from talking to the folks at GE or from listening to their statements that this isn't who he is. He is not a person that spills his guts about his personal life. He's not a person that discusses his personal life with his coworkers. And he said, yeah, but he did. He talked to Melanie White. He talked to Orna Hannison. Well, exactly. During this period of time, he calls his real estate agent about possibly a short sale of his house. And then he proceeds to call her, email her over and over and over and over again about his relationship with Andrea Sneiderman, seeking out her opinion. It's his real estate agent. It's not his friend. This isn't somebody he would normally confide in. It's not normal to just call up your real estate agent and start spilling your guts.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, you've been going right in an hour. As I indicated, I will give you a break, and this will, with the assistance of Deputy Moore, after you come back from this 10-minute break, and it'll be 10 minutes Deputy Deere, I'm sorry, Deputy Moore, the lawyer will have an hour to conclude. By law, they have up to 2 hours, and she's been going right in an hour. So I try to give you a break so you can be refreshed. Deputy Moore, put it back in the box in 10 minutes precisely.
All right. Maybe see.